afternoon, everyone. The full statement from Dr. Jekyll in Robert Louis Stevenson's masterpiece, Dr. Jekyll.
Sorry, are you speaking in the mic?
Oh, God, I've never been accused of being quiet, right? It's not on, it's on. Okay. Right, add on more than it. Right, the full statement from Dr. Jekyll at the end of Robert Louis Stevenson's masterpiece, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, says, "I learned to recognise the thorough and primitive duality of man. I saw that of the two natures that contended in the field of my consciousness, even if I could rightly be said to be either, it was only because I was radically both." He then goes on to say, "It was the curse of mankind that these incongruous faggots were bound together, that in the agonised womb of consciousness, these pole twins should be continually struggling." Meanwhile, in Portrait of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, more straightforwardly, Dorian Gray tells the artist Basil, who has painted the picture that will go on to be his soul, each of us has heaven and hell in him. Novelists, dramatists and poets have been creating literary works exploring just that theme of the civil war inside all of us, who we are, for many hundreds of years. The setting sometimes changes. In those two Victorian novels, the hell is London. Dorian speaks of, quote, "this grey, monstrous London of ours, with its myriad of people, its sordid sinners, and its splendid sins." But what all of them asks, wherever they're set and wherever they're written, but they ask it in different ways, is how much are we a saint or a sinner, a beast or a gentleman, a devil or an angel? How much are we body or mind, soul or body? How much are we dominated by our passions or by our reason? That has been one of literature's great themes, and I'm going to attempt to give some insight into a few of the books that are on the reading list. I'm going to start, though, by quoting that well-known passage from Hobbes's Leviathan that we heard about this morning, but I have a slightly different take on it than Professor Faragi. So, to remind you, the full quote says, "In such condition, there is no place for industry because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea. No commodious buildings, no instruments of moving and removing of such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fears, and a danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Interestingly, one of the most persuasive and certainly one of the most memorable apparent rebuttals of this outlook was not a work of philosophy or politics at all, but was a work of fiction. It was, in fact, Daniel Defoe's The Life and Strange Adventures of Robinson Crusoe of York, which is to be, as it were, my foundation text for this lecture. Published in 1719, credited as being the first ever English novel, it gives us a hero who, forcibly removed into the state of nature when shipwrecked on a desert island, actually seems to rebut every single one of those things listed by Hobbes when he becomes a model of industrious activity. And Robinson never ceases over his 27 years on the island to step by step build his own civilization. As James Joyce wrote, Robinson Crusoe, who cast away on a desert island, in his pocket a knife and a pipe, becomes an architect, a carpenter, a knife grinder, an astronomer, a baker, a shipwright, a potter, a saddler, a farmer, a tailor, an umbrella maker. One of the joys of the novel is Robinson's use of human ingenuity and reason, as it were, and we're with him all the way as he painstakingly masters the art of basket making, builds a chair and a table, builds a wall, domesticates and raises a herd of goats. I was so excited when, after planting his fields of corn, eventually he manages to make bread. And as we watch him recreate civilization alone, he makes us look at the activities and necessities of everyday life that are so much part of being human in a new way. He says himself, "It is a little wonderful, and what I believe few people have thought upon, the stranger multitude of things necessary in the providing, curing, dressing, making and furnishing this one article of bread. We enjoy each discovery with Crusoe. I was willing him on to realise that the goats were not just meat, but milk and cheese and butter, and cheered when he worked it out. As Coleridge notes, Crusoe becomes, quote, the universal representative, the person for whom every reader could substitute himself. So as to Hobbes' notion that man in nature would have no commodious buildings, well, they obviously don't know anything about Robinson's numerous summer homes, winter homes, and the whole range of DIY activity he gets up in doing up his houses. But maybe it's unfair to refute Hobbes, a philosopher who condemned metaphor as an illusion, arguing that true statements are constructed by exact definitions. Maybe we can't refute him with the metaphorical work of fiction, even though Hobbes used fiction. Maybe we can't come back on him with a novel, a particular form of literary work. Even Locke, whose more optimistic view of natural man is closer to Defoe's, and many argue that the Robinson Crusoe is a Lockean novel, even Locke attacks, quote, all the artificial and figurative applications of words. I think this slight exchange raises an interesting issue and dilemma for us in the literature strand for the rest of the week. What is the balance between reading literature as political tracts and trying to understand the philosophical ideas that so many of these literary works contains? And to complicate matters more, Defoe actually only turned to writing this novel when he was late in his life, at 60. Until then, he was actually better known as a political propagandist, a pamphleteer and a journalist. And much of his non-fiction work was preoccupied with the issue of the best way to organise society. And like his peers and everyone involved in politics, philosophy and religion at the time, was asking questions about the nature of man. And although Robinson Crusoe is a work of fiction, the character has become, since and at the time, a useful abstraction for political theorists and economists and philosophers rather than literary theorists, and has been for the next 2 centuries. We all know that in Rousseau's Emile, in the education of Emile, where the argument is put that no books are necessary to stimulate the natural impulse of a child, that's no books except Robinson Crusoe, quote, the one book that teaches all that books can teach. And Karl Marx in Das Kapital uses Robinson Crusoe as an example of pre-capitalist man producing goods because they're useful to him and producing only as much as is useful to him, almost an originator of the economic system of value based on an item's use as we understand it today. So we take a lot of our political ideas or economic ideas from this novel. Of course, we need to remind ourselves that this is literature and not politics. And even a literary row, but having said that, even an apparent literary row with Swift is worth noting in this context. Swift published in 1726 the Travels with Several Remote Nations of the World by Lemuel Gulliver, first a surgeon and then a captain of several ships, otherwise known as Gulliver's Travels. And what was interesting was that it was considered to be a direct rebuttal of Defoe's optimistic account of human capability and reason in Robinson Crusoe. But actually Swift himself was actively a political pamphleteer, a political satirist, and so the merger between and the lines between literature and politics again start to get blurry. Whatever Swift's political intent, and this is as an aside, Gulliver's Travels is an incredibly rich work of imagination, deploying literary device of satire to devastating and often hilarious effect, and I'm afraid I barely mention it in this lecture. I just wanted to recommend that in case you haven't read it in preparation for this and think you know the story, do read it, you don't know the story, and then reread it again. A key question for us then is, what does fictionalising or turning into literature what does fictionalising these ideas in a literary form bring to the table? At its most obvious level, Defoe, in relation to Robinson Crusoe, imaginatively dumps a solitary man into a solitary deserted island with no society and works out through the novel how he'd cope. The point about literature is it allows those questions to be asked. It allows lots of questions to be asked, but it also allows you to be evasive about the answers. You can actually raise ambiguities, ambivalence and contradictory positions and nuances and not get stuck in a black and white dichotomy. Yes, Defoe uses the novel to make some political and philosophical points, and he has a clear bias towards Locke as against Hobbes. But he's definitely not a black and white Lockean, anti-Hobbesian propagandist. And the main point is that literature allows a subjective reflection that's not easily categorizable. Crusoe might be every man, but he's not any man. He's a real flesh and blood man, if you see what I mean. He's not a paper cutout. Fiction's versatility in exploring ideas in a complex way is well exemplified by the fictitious deserted island itself, man completely alone with nature. Critics of Defoe, who read the novel as a literal attempt to answer political challenges, point out its limits, such as the state of nature which Crusoe has lived in, a solitary life on an island possessed of purity, cannot be duplicated, which is obviously true. And others have mocked that it's fine for Defoe to create this utopian society, but that's easy to create if there's only one citizen with no others to corrupt or destroy or compete with the harmony. Even Crusoe himself notes that he was, quote, removed from all wickedness in the world here, and that he was, quote, he had neither the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, or the pride of life. I had nothing to covet, there was no rivals, I had no competition, none to dispute my sovereignty or command me. On the one hand, this shows that the novel can't really be the basis of an evidence-based policy on a natural-based man, or whether he'll become competitive or rule or be ruled if there's only him there. But also, this imagined physical isolation allows Defoe to make some metaphorical points in relation to sovereignty. When our rather sardonic Robinson Crusoe notes, I was the lord of the whole manor, or if I pleased I might call myself king or emperor over the whole country which I had possession of. This is, he's making, on the one hand, he's the kind of character that we know is kind of like quite boastful and kind of having a bit of a joke, but he's also making a point about, or I think the point is being made rather, we're being asked to consider the importance of self-governance and self-mastery. He's had to survive alone on this island, but it's not just been a physical conquest of nature, it's also been a struggle to conquer himself, to become governor of his own passions. He's been forced to turn inwards, to come to know himself, and that's of course tied up in the story with the religious conversion, but he has to grapple with his own inner nature. And interestingly, while he becomes self-reliant, we also learn something else, which is he never becomes less a social animal as a man, even though he's on his own. He tries to make society on his own. He trains up a parrot to speak to him, to say his name, just to hear another voice. He makes a little family of his animals and has them round for tea. Aristotle makes the point a man who is unable to live in a society or has no need because he is sufficient must either be a beast or a god. Crusoe is neither, and even though isolated, he craves other human beings' company, and that's his greatest deprivation. And his greatest deprivation isn't material, but a lack of society and other humans. And despite having no contact with human beings for years, he remains surprisingly humane. Look at his response to the arrival of Friday. Although he's wary and for years has only ever had to consider his own safety, now he must decide the fate of someone else. And what is someone else? Nothing less than a savage and a cannibal. But despite this, Robinson Crusoe rescues him, feeds him, befriends him, arguably loves him, even if it's a servant, and lets him sleep in his fortified habitation fairly early on, and they end up in relations of mutual trust. It's no surprise then, at the start of the building of a much larger society, that this coincides with the building of a larger society on the island, the realisation of that sociability of man. And far from the arrival of that fellow human being resulting in war between men, set up as competitors, threatening each other, forever fearful of each other, Crusoe gradually abandons his isolation and embraces society, and shows man as social animal. And what's more, we see that two men allows for comparative security of social state of nature, less fear rather than more, and more purposeful activity. The isolation of the island also gave Defoe a literary device to allow us access to the interiority of his character. Remember, this is centuries before we've had the modernist turn or stream of consciousness. Of course, Defoe uses the well-established journal method, but also you literally have Crusoe talking to himself because nobody else is there, and we get to listen to him. We're able to access our hero's contemplations and mood swings. We may try and look as though we all know that when we have to speak publicly, we try and look as though we know what we believe, to sound as though we're quite certain. In any kind of public discourse, you don't jump around and disagree with yourself all the time. But that goes on in our heads all the time. It's going on in mine now. We're pulled in all sorts of different ways. That self-reflection that's working out in our mind, that somebody like that somebody like James Joyce lets us see many years later. Actually, we begin to get glimpses of it in a literary sense here as Robinson Crusoe works out the pros and cons of every decision, and we eavesdrop into his uncertain mental meanderings. I think the strength of this approach is reflected in the novel's treatment of fear. Hobbes talks of the worst aspect of life for men in a state of nature being continual fear and danger of violent death. And certainly that is reflected in the experience of Robinson Crusoe. For example, for almost a whole year after finding the footprint, he lives in a state of continuous fear. He hides his boat, he makes no fires, he's afraid to fire his gun, he's fearful even of chopping woods. In fact, it's fear that almost turns him into a savage brute, like an animal constantly on guard for his life. And there's that very vivid picture when he sees those demonic wild eyes in the darkness staring at him, and he's absolutely terrified, and so are we. But it ends up being an old goat who is actually terrified himself, and he's hiding before death. And then Crusoe retreats to a cave, and the analogy is obvious. But, in case we think that's the permanent state of affairs, we also get to share those moments of, whilst we get to share those moments of terror with the protagonist and note how fear is debilitating and brings out the animal in man, Robinson also shows us it can be overcome by right reason. And he shares his own bemusement with his own paranoia and irrationalism. He says, "To what ridiculous resolution men take when possessed with fear, it deprives them of the use of those means which reason offers for their relief." And then, thus fear of danger is 10,000 times more terrifying than danger itself, and we find the burden of anxiety greater by much, the evil which we are anxious about. We are also privy to some extraordinary inner monologues about whether he should kill the savages who's been watching, devouring and eating human beings. His instinct is that he should murder them and who can blame him. But mastering his own passions by applying right reason, he concludes, quote, "They are innocent of any crime against me. What authority have I to be their executioner?" He also reasons that if he killed them, his action would be unnatural, since it wouldn't be in self-defence, making him no more than a savage himself. And then Riley, we know, because we've got to know Robinson Crusoe, that he's always a pragmatist. He notes that he's worried that if he kills the savages and any of them survive, they'll come back and kill him. It's worth dwelling on this theme of savages for a moment, and to note something of the obsession in the 17th and 18th century with savages and cannibals and pagans and primitive societies. Note it's two-sided. It was either used to illustrate the depth to which human nature can fall when deprived of European civilization and Christianity, or by sentimentalists like Antonio Shaftesbury, that set primitive societies are examples of the positive state of innocence, uncorrupted by civilization. Primitives almost treated as though they're free from the sin of Adam, what man looked like before the fall, before men knew how to sin. So let's look at how Friday is treated as in the novel. He's neither of those things, I think. He's certainly not the noble savage, even though he comes over as noble in the end. And he is used to illustrate, I think, man's innate goodness, or at least the potential for it. He does have an innate humane spirit of generosity, warmth, and intellectual curiosity. Friday only moves, but the thing to note is that Friday only moves from savagery to goodness after he's been educated. He has a potential for goodness, but he needs some education to move from naked cannibal who eats meat uncooked and shock horror unsalted, to one who learns to farm and cook, although he never gets used to salt. He actually is easily converted to Christianity. We're told he's an apt scholar, constantly diligent, eager and adept at learning English. This is no Caliban. Ironically, the civilizing of Friday is exactly what allows him to become a natural man. And I think it's worth noting that when we talk about natural man and unnatural man, as we were warned by Frank Ferrari this morning, there's a lot of confusion, particularly that our contemporary sensibilities bring to the issue. So Crusoe notes that cannibalism is the unnatural custom of that people, that man left to his abominable passions of savages like animals, less than human. That's not naturally human to eat another human being. This brutishness is not, by the way, just because they're from a primitive tribe, as it happens, because anything that it applies to everyone who gives license to their appetites, and the missing ingredient is right reason. So Crusoe even says of himself before his religious conversion that when he was without desire of good or consciousness of evil, then he acted like a mere brute from the principles of nature. Similarly, it's important to interrogate what any particular writer means by nature. So to conclude the section on Robinson Crusoe, we should note that Defoe had no romantic attachment to nature, was no romantic in relation to that. He didn't, when he was on the island, find himself by going back to nature or learn from the natural savages. All those years on the island paradise of natural beauty, he never expresses any aesthetic or transcendental thoughts about nature. Rather, he is pitted against the forces of nature. He needs to conquer and tame it and consider it a resource to be exploited. And in several passages, Crusoe contemplates what his life would have been like if he hadn't recovered man's way of conquering nature, that is, the tools and the weapons from the wreck. He knows that the carpenter's chest was more valuable than a shipload of gold. He knows that without civilization in the form of tools, he would actually be less than human. Without a knife, he'd have been forced to gnaw at his prey with his teeth and pull it with his hands, like a mere savage, like a beast. And that image of beasts like humans pulling apart flesh with their hands, I think very vividly sums up the difference between civilized man and natural man, as some people see it, or rather natural man and unnatural man, as Defoe would see it. And I want to move on one way to another way that mankind in Western tradition thinks about man housing both savage and bestial side and their civilized and reasonable side within them. And that's the competition for men's soul between the devil and God, or the struggle for all of us to resist the temptation of sin. And I particularly, this is often kind of, if you think of Marlowe's Dr. Faust, not on reading this, but this idea of the kind of the good angel whispering on one ear, the bad angel in the other, trying to tempt us one way or another, a kind of internal civil war. And of course, the origin of the corruption of humanity is located by something as in original sin, the fall of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. So now we arrive both at Milton's Paradise Lost, published in 1674, and 10 books, and then 12, and then Goethe's Faust from the early 1800s, and then 30 years later. These great works of literature have similar characters. They have gods, and they have angels, and they have heaven. They have Satan and fallen angels in one. They have Mephistopheles and witches and spirits in the other. And right in the middle of that mix, you have mankind, either Adam and Eve or Faust. And so I want to consider what this literature brings to what literature brings to the kind of religious and theological and biblical retellings of man's nature. Of course, I'm a bit nervous at this point. Goethe's the poet Prince, the German Shakespeare, Paradise Lost, one of the finest pieces of epic English poetry ever written. I noted when I was going through this that Milton as the narrator in Paradise Lost, whilst not modest in ambition and quite openly says that he's going to not only emulate Homer and Virgil, but by far better them, he suddenly becomes rather nervous about dealing with the story of God and mankind, and becomes rather overwhelmed by the task of writing of God. And so as a consequence, he fairly regularly in the text calls on the Muses and the Holy Spirit for inspiration. I have to say that taking on two of the greatest works of literature and squeezing them in at this point in my speech meant that I've called on the Muses rather a lot recently. But the problem is, because I'm an atheist, it hasn't worked. So I apologise in advance for any violence I do these texts, including skating over their beautiful language, their depth of meaning, and so on. And what I really want to do is to raise a few queries with you that arise in the text, and just to kind of ask you to consider certain things. One thing I want you to ask is, why do we always find the devil so attractive? And why is God so boring? Milton's Satan whether he intended him to be so or not, becomes a romantic hero for many following him. Dark, brooding man, what lurks underneath, think Heathcliff, and so on. The part of Milton's literary challenge is to try and depict the character of Satan and God successfully, to elicit on the one hand our contempt for Satan and our awe for God. But one of the controversies over the centuries that's argued over still now as to an interpretation of the great work is whether Milton intended or not to make Satan the epic poem's hero. William Blake famously says that Milton is, as a true poet, is of the devil's party without knowing it. Shelley says that nothing can exceed the energy and magnificence of the character of Satan. Milton's devil is a moral being and is far superior to his God, as one who pursues in some purpose in spite of adversity and torture. Undoubtedly, one of the reasons why Satan has an appeal for the likes of Blake and Shelley is in the first two books, he comes over as something of an archetypal rebel, fighting the tyranny of God and heaven, which seems to leave no room for dissent. And the famous quote, "Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven," he proclaims, maybe appeals to all of us who are a bit bolshy. No one reading the inspired verse that Milton puts into the speeches that are uttered by Satan can miss the power of the eloquence or not be stirred up. What though the field is lost? All is not lost. The unconquerable will, the study of revenge, immortal hate, and courage never to submit or yield. And what is else not to overcome? This seemingly heroic, magnificent determination to overcome the adversity of being banished to hell and up against invincible odds, and his refusal to bow in submission, I think encapsulates a very human virtue that we admire as somebody rallying the troops. But I do actually think it's a misreading. I don't think that Milton allows us ever to think that. Or rather, he fools us into thinking it for a little while, but that's our fault, not his. Milton goes to rather great lengths, in fact, to make a distinction between Satan's rhetorical public freedom fighting and comparing it to which he thinks is artificial and not genuine, compared to the real liberty given to Adam and Eve, who were given free will by God. And the message seems to be that life without God may have the illusion of freedom, but in fact it's servitude to self. You're enslaved to your passions, and he wants to distinguish between license and freedom. One way of refuting Satan as an inadvertent hero of the piece is a realization that he is actually incapable of having any internal redemption or any internal dilemmas. The whole treatment of his public performance versus internal and private one is very interesting. Satan, who seems so very attractive, is actually only contained, or is largely contained within books 1 and 2. The potency and majesty of his public speeches and vigour are matched by his majestic public appearance. He above the rest in shape and gesture, proudly eminent, stood like a tower, his form not yet lost all her original brightness. He has brows of dauntless courage, a shield as big as a moon, a spear like the tallest pine tree, and a range of superlatives emphasises size and majesty. But Satan has no internal soliloquies at that point, and we don't hear anything from him internally, and so we're therefore judging him by appearances. But we can maybe get a hint that his public grandiosity and bravery are not to be relied on when you consider the lengthy developed epic simile which compares Satan's huge size and power to a Leviathan whale. Of course, the Leviathan whale deceives people, and we're told this in the poem. Those fishermen and sailors in distress who mistake the Leviathan for an island or a rock and try and anchor on his back have fallen for a terrible illusion, and maybe so have we. In Book 1, he also makes a seemingly impassioned argument for the strength of the mind and imagination to overcome all difficulties. So Satan says the mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell and a hell of heaven. But actually we then find that his mind is fixed, and his mind is not to be changed. And this is rather the principle and brave determination, more that he's determining himself to not move. And we see from his internal state later on that hell is within him. Which way I fly is hell, myself is hell. So for all the rhetoric of freedom fighting, he's actually himself not fighting at all, determined. Satan and the fallen angels constantly deny that they have free will, and whether they do or they don't is arguable. But they actually try and say that the reason why they lost the war in heaven was because of fate, or chance, or God. They're constantly blaming someone else, it's not their fault, won't take responsibility, and so on. And in book 4, Satan even questions whether he'd have fallen or not if God had created him with less pride. Again, if only you hadn't made me like that, then I wouldn't have rebelled, and so on and so forth. I think we have to contrast that determinism and that fixed internal, no dilemma, no civil war going on with humans. The humans in the original state of nature, Adam and Eve, are created free, we are told by Milton. God says, I formed them free, and free they must remain. They enthrall themselves. In book 3, it's clear why this is so important. This omniscient God, who can see the fall in the future, of course is rather keen, this is not particularly pleasant characters, but he's rather keen that people don't blame him for the fate or the acts of evil. His foreknowledge is not determining. As if predestination overruled their will, despised by absolute decree or high foreknowledge. They themselves decreed their own revolt, not I. After the fall, salvation is especially dependent on them having free will and individual action and choice. Without free will, man is incapable of the love of God. He's merely going through the motions. Man must have free will in order to prove his sincerity. In book 12, there's an interesting reflection on this idea of voluntarily choosing God, and this being part of the nature of fallen man. When the Archangel Michael relates the story of the future of mankind to Adam, there's an interesting discussion on the old law of the Old Testament, which enforces obedience for fear of divine retribution and demands servile discipline. Archangel Michael characterises this old law as for childish creatures in an infantile state of humanity who only obey God out of a fear of punishment. Instead, he eulogises the shift to manly freedom in the New Testament Gospels when Christians can choose Christ. Satan's fixed internal state contrasts, I think, with this idea that constantly, sorry, I've lost my place. That's true. Sorry. Right. The point about the genuine. Right, I'm just going to stop. I've lost the page, so we can go. Right. The point about the archangel showing them the meaning that they are now manlike and have choice, I think puts Satan into the infantile section of the argument. And also it emphasises that part of maturity is that we have the capacity internally to love God. Conscience is a promise from God. Who shall dwell, his spirit with them, and the law of faith working through them? Upon their hearts shall write to guide them to the truth. Well, to console them with the tragedy of the fall, at the end of Paradise Lost, Archangel Michael encourages them by saying, then will thou not be loath to leave this paradise, but shall possess the paradise within thee, the happier fall. So if Satan has got this very fixed hell inside them, our fallen man now has God's conscience written on his heart and heaven inside him. A paradise within the happier far. So Milton suggests that the fallen condition is indeed fortunate, because now, informed by conscience, man can regain heaven through eternal redemption, and with the burden of religious doctrine etched on their hearts, they can be guided to the truth, but only through themselves and their own freedom. The final image of Adam and Eve walking hand in hand, the world was all before them, and they now embark on a journey that every man and woman will take in life. And you can't help feeling, as they wander off into the future, whether they're wandering off into the next instalment, which is Goethe's Faust. Before we go there, I wanted to just dwell on the end of Paradise Lost and this great tragedy of man's fall. Because you might have noticed that this great tragedy of man's fall, even though I kind of slightly messed up explaining it to you, actually isn't such a tragedy at all. It's rather a happy ending. And although they're crying, they kind of go off all hopeful into the future, knowing they're in control of their own destiny to a certain extent. There's a happy ending in Faust too. At the heart of both works is the idea that man is flawed, that man as flawed in struggle. At the heart of both works is the idea that man is flawed, but that in struggling to be good and striving to be better and in resisting evil, that almost is what makes us human and is not such a disaster after all. So the concept used to describe this ambivalence towards the fall is the happy or the fortunate fall. And in fact, in book 12, at the climax of Paradise Lost, Adam refers to his own sin as Felix culpa, a happy fall. And in referring to Faust, Goethe's friend, the playwright Friedrich Schiller in the 18th century, talking about the biblical fall, conceded that, of course, it was precipitated a catastrophe for mankind, but wanted to go to great lengths to point out that the fall was an absolutely necessary first step in the highest development of mankind. With the fall, the mind of man embarks on the realization of its limitless possibilities, and without it, man would forever have remained a child of nature, innocent but ignorant, unable to develop the faculties to distinguish between good and evil. Now, moving on to Faust, and I definitely can't do it credit. For those of you who haven't read this, this is not the usual Faustian pact of the medieval legend or Marlowe's Dr. Faustus play, in that in which man sells his soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge and then gets dragged off to hell at the end. Not to put a spoiler on it. There's a modern rendition, of course, that we've hopefully all read, which is Wilde's Dorian Gray. But in Goethe's Faust, in fact, there are two barters, or two wagers with the devil, and arguably the most important one is in the opening, in the prologue in heaven, which is a barter between God and the devil over Faust's soul, which I'm going to look at in a minute. I think it's worth asking why, or what is Faustian, as it were, about Goethe's Faust, as essay question. It doesn't actually follow the Faust story at all, it seems, or does it? The prologue to heaven sets up an overarching conflict of the narrative. The scene in heaven opens with two conflicting versions of the world. God asks for the report of the world, and the angels paint the scene of beautiful perfection of forces of nature, the universe, and earth's full splendour. But Mephistopheles, the Satan devil, offers us a different point of view and describes the miserable fate of mankind. I can't sing hymns about the universe. I only see how people go from bad to worse. He hasn't changed, your little God on earth. He's still peculiar as the day you gave him birth. He'd live a better life, at least, if you'd not given him a glimpse of heaven's light. He calls it reason, which gives him the right to be more bestial than any beast, saving your gracious presence. Sire, I'd say, he's like a silly grasshopper in the hay. He chirps and sings and flitters to and fro and chirps the same old song and jumps about. If only he was satisfied with that, but no, in every pile of filth he dips his snout. He then goes on, when the Lord says, why are you telling me this again? He says, no, Lord, I'm pleased to say it's still completely rotten. I feel quite sorry for the miserable plight. When it's not as bad as that, tormenting him's not right. Sorry, when he's having it as bad as that. So Mephistopheles makes the point that man has made such a hell on earth for himself that even the Satan tempting him can't make things even worse. He's made himself miserable. To note, the blame for what's happened to man is now attached to reason. A glimpse of heaven's light, he calls it reason. And maybe that's a shift from some of the other texts that I've discussed, in which reason, right reason at least, is the saviour, is the kind of good part for mankind. In Faust, it's much more ambivalent. And obviously we've seen it's been very ambivalent in Gulliver's Tales, particularly in Voyage 3 as well, so that's something to maybe discuss later. When we have the wager for Faust's soul between God and Mephistopheles, we discover that God isn't worried at all if the devil can tempt man with the usual sins. He knows that a good man, through his instincts, though his instincts be obscure, is still conscious of the proper way. The sin that God worries about is that he'll stop striving, that the real sin is non-action. And his bet with Mephistopheles is that Faust will keep on striving, and despite the many errors and judgments he'll make and the wrong turns, he'll always be able to find a path back to righteousness if he continues this striving, known as Faustian striving. Striving is a moral act, complacency is a sin. And the irony for God is that if Mephistopheles can spur on Faust to strive a bit more, then the devil will be helping redeem him. For God, for men's activity, so God says, for man's activity can slacken all too fast. He falls too soon into a slothful ease. The devil's a companion who will tease and spur him on and work creatively at last. I want to consider Faustian striving and what it means, and the basis of the play, of the great work. It's hard to describe of the drama, books 1 and 2. I think striving is the key, and maybe we could discuss that. But it is a bit of a conundrum, because I think we have to ask what sort of striving. It doesn't certainly appear to be the striving for further intellectual knowledge. Down on earth, after we've been in heaven, we meet a suicidal Faust at his desk at night time in a vaulted, narrow Gothic room, talking to himself. Medicine and law and philosophy, you've worked your way through every school, even, God help you, theology, and sweated at it like a fool. Why labour at it any more? You're no wiser than you were before. There's a brilliant rendering of the human impotence and the utter despair and isolation and alienation of discovering that your whole life's work is pointless, which, if you're one of the scholars at this academy, might be rather dispiriting. And I can see, and you'll have noticed, it says, and I see all our search for knowledge is in vain, and this burns my heart with bitter pain. The question for discussion is, why is knowledge so often associated with the negative aspects of man's nature? The Bible and Paradise Lost associate man's fall with the tree of nature. Adam is reprimanded by the angels in Paradise Lost for asking too many travels in Gulliver's Travels. Those who seek too much knowledge end up brutally parodied. Now we have Faust. His bookish knowledge here is viciously attacked. The deadening nature of it is personified in the dull and pedantic and unimaginative scholarly assistant Wagner, whose interest in studying the classical world is dismissed by Faust as nothing more than piles of garbage and heaps of trash. But it all seems very contradictory. Faust's complaint is not that what's the point of knowledge? Is that he doesn't know enough, and that what he strives for is to know more, but to know more of everything, to have everything. He's pulsing to have the secrets of life and men, and that means more knowledge. And even the kind of lampooning of Wagner is confusing, because by the time we get to book 2, which of those of you who haven't read it is completely bonkers, in the sense that you don't know what's happening and then you have to go with it. It's one of the most important works of imagination happens in book 2, but its narrative arc is complicated. But anyway, at some point in book 2, Faust, and it's a long story, ends up, certainly does not dismiss the knowledge of classical Greece or its insights, or find it stultifying or deadening. Instead, he actually strives to make the classical world his own. He goes to the bowels of the earth to bring forth the spirit of Paris and Helen. He goes in pursuit of Helen throughout ancient Greece, and eventually marries her in Arcadia and so on. And you get the sense that he wants to inhabit, to make real that tradition of classical Greece. So it's not knowledge per se that's being thrown out. When Wagner becomes a Dr. Frankenstein in book 2 as well, he creates a life, a human life. He creates a tiny humanoid figure in a bottle called the homunculus. It's the high point of Wagner's scholarly attainment, but of course it bears no semblance to real life. It's not real flesh and blood. And I suppose that in some ways the homunculus is that idea of reason but not human, knowledge but dead, not able to realise itself. The homunculus, the personification of intellect with none of the emotions to allow human beings to live, to aspire, to make mistakes, to redeem themselves, eventually throws himself into the ocean, where he's transformed into a potent life spirit with the prospect of eventually developing his real manhood through nature's evolutionary scheme. And this theme of man's unity with nature is the final thing I want to mention as a key part of Faust. Goethe was more ambivalent than many of today's more environmentally minded literary critics about what nature has to offer, but it's just interesting to consider that he urges the spirits to grant me the vision of nature's forces that bid the world all its seeds and sources and innermost life, all I shall see, and stop peddling words that mean nothing to me. I read that wrong. Basically, the words mean nothing. He calls on nature to save him, and nature is very forcibly part, particularly of part one, as part of the realisation of him becoming fully human, of realising himself, of striving and so on. And inevitably Wagner is the one who doesn't get it, who says, "One soon grows sick of forest, field and brook, and I shall never envy birds that wings. Far greater are the joys that spirit brings from page to page, from book to book." But the natural world the natural world is not straightforwardly realised throughout Faust. One of the things that's interesting, I think, is that when we get a sort of bringing together of nature and striving in this, is that there's a point early in book one where Faust sets about translating the Gospel of St. John, and he says into German, and he goes through, in the beginning was the word, no, that doesn't work. In the beginning was the mind, no, that doesn't work. In the beginning was power, and he rejects that. And he finally settles on, in the beginning was deed. And in some ways, it's deed combined with a deed on earth, activity on earth, combined with nature, that is the saving grace of Faust. By the end of the book two, his final deed, his final activity that he settles on, is to battle against the forces of nature and embark on a scheme for the reclamation of the lands of the sea and and drain the marshes. He can no longer be tempted so easily by Mephisto. He tells him that his activity, is man's natural element, and his desire to reclaim useless land submerged beneath the sea, because he has a moral aversion to inactivity and sterility, is the way that his vision of an earthly paradise is to be realised. He's given up at this point searching for divine knowledge. He knows that the only knowledge that's worthwhile, the only activities that are worthwhile, is here on the earth. And despite setbacks, including, rather inconveniently, the killing off of an old couple who stand in the way of the dam, actually this becomes his great life's project, and one could argue about how we deal with this. So I'll finish with my favourite quote for you to reflect on. End of his life's work. In green and fertile fields on virgin soil, within the shelter of banks erected by tireless labour, they shall live protected. And though the sea may rage at will outside, a paradise shall flourish here. The tide may gnaw and batter at the dikes, but each and every one will rush to close the breach. This is the vision that inspires me. This is my wisdom's final word, that they who must defend their freedom every day deserve to live lives that are truly free. To repeat, that they who must defend their freedom every day deserve to live lives that are truly free. So here, behest by danger, each shall spend a life of honest effort to the end. A happy throng. If only I could see upon free land a people truly free, then to the passing moment I might say, you are so beautiful, I bid you stay. He tackles nature. He cooperates with himself in building a dam and is redeemed. He says the fateful words, you are so beautiful that I will stay. He hasn't reached perfection. He isn't faultless. He's not an ideal human being, but he's become a co-creator of works of nature's creation, and he's sung the praises of freedom. He's done this through an act of reason and cognition. in his own terms. And guess what? Although he loses the wager, he isn't damned. Off to heaven he goes. Hollywood ending again. Seems it's not so bad to be human after all.
So I can come straight out for any questions anyone may have on anything, not necessarily what Claire said, but any of the other texts that you want to speak about. So I will go to the front first, and then maybe there to the middle.
Thanks, Claire. It's just, I have to say, it was a broad range of literature in many decades, and I guess the thing about saying, well, here's a universal theme of nature versus man is sort of true, but it's perhaps the first question you raised up, which is how far does literature relate perhaps to its ideas and its specificity of its time, and then how far can it be a sort of transcendental discussion, which you then did seem to perhaps say we can compare Milton through to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Jekyll and Dr. Hyde, and surely the ideas of state of nature versus the state of reason at any point in time is more historically bound by that, and perhaps just the one I want to look at is Milton's Paradise Lost, because your beginning of saying Hobbes, throwing out Hobbes, perhaps the text that most can look at where Hobbes is in relationship to that is Paradise Lost, and I think quite interesting when you think Hobbes versus Milton, we'd say they're definitely in the different sides of the corner. Hobbes great monarchist and Milton the Republican that we all know. But in fact, doesn't Paradise Lost, it seems to me, echo very much Hobbes in the end? So you just think, well, they're thinking and in the same era, because I will not serve as I say, portrait. Satan's big sin is to say I will not serve, and the quote we say, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. But in the end, man, the way man, as you say, comes back to God is through what we're talking about this morning, surely, a sort of, yes, I will serve God, but now it is my individual conscience rather than, through voluntary action rather than an enforcement. It seems to be very similar to what we're talking about Hobbes, and I just feel that your refutation, Daniel Defoe refuting Hobbes, is, that 50-year period is a very important period philosophically. You've got Smith, you've got Hume, you've got Locke, but you just, I guess that's my difficulty in perhaps how we look at literature as transcendent and historically specific at the same time.
Okay, thanks. And to Dave, and then we'll go towards the back.
Yeah, I just wonder how much Robinson Crusoe really does refute at least the version of Hobbes that we heard earlier. That actually Robinson Crusoe is a fallen angel from the start. He rejects the authority of his father. He doesn't listen to his father's advice. He rebels. He then lives in a natural state. He is a slaver. He also becomes enslaved. He lives in a world of kind of barbarism. And it's only actually by getting onto the island that he can create his artificial sort of sense of authority, and he elects himself as an authority. But eventually, and of course the great irony of the book is the more and more he takes control of his own destiny, the more he comes to relish the authority of God and to providence. And that sort of symbolised that sort of ambivalence quite neatly in the way in which he builds a cross. But it becomes a memorial to himself rather than to Christ. It's about Robinson on the island rather than it is about this God that he worships so much. But ultimately, authority is always there. He exerts his freedom to a certain extent, but ultimately he needs to submit to the authority of God to be able to reconcile himself. So is this actually not quite a conservative book, ultimately, in its messages? Actually, maybe it is a little bit more Hobbesian than Lockean.
Okay, thanks. Where is the microphone? Okay.
Hi Claire, thanks very much. I was just wondering what, if any, is there any compromise between the infantile behaviour of Satan and the quest for knowledge portrayed by Faust? Can you find any common ground there, or is there none at all?
Okay, thanks. And there was a lady with a... Yeah.
I think it's really interesting, Claire, just going back to the first part of what you were saying, to look at the recurring metaphor of islands that's used in literature after having read Hobbes. I mean, I'm starting with The Tempest, and not even just the island as a metaphor, but the way that the people who arrive on the island relate to the original inhabitants of the island. So thinking of Caliban in The Tempest, and he says of Prospero, you taught me language, and the profit of it is I know how to curse. And we relate that to something that Hobbes says in Leviathan about how men are distinguished from all other living creatures by the help of speech, that it's speech and language that distinguishes man. I'm just wondering how that relates to kind of what Caliban was saying. But it's interesting just to see how authors are kind of continually reinterpreting this metaphor of the island, or the island of state of nature. If you look at Coral Island, Ballantyne's Coral Island, written in Victorian times, it seems to me that that's a real kind of propagation of the kind of white man's burden and the myth of empire, and how obviously you've got a small group of white settlers then going over and kind of taming the natives, if you like. But then you look at how that Coral Island story was then retold after the Second World War in Lord of the Flies, obviously with completely different outcomes.
Okay, thanks. I'll take one more and then I will come back out, so don't worry. Are any hands over there? Just the closest one. There's a lady. Keep your hand up. Keep your hand up. Yeah. Possible.
One of the things that I found so interesting, having read some of these texts, I must confess, for the first time, was the whole conception of free will. Because, you know, when at the end of Paradise Lost, Adam talks about actually a happy fall, it does sort of bring to the fore the idea that free will, before man has to actually strive against nature, rather than have everything given to him in a sort of natural state, it's only when he has to actually strive against nature that his humanity and a genuine free will can be exercised. And I suppose, I hope not sort of straining it too much. I mean, I thought that was very much the theme, you know, in Robinson Crusoe, that it is through activity that man actually exercises control over himself and his passions. And I mean, in Robinson Crusoe, it's kind of a sort of a romantic industry, you know, basket weaving and all of that, whereas in Paradise Lost, it's much more the control, you know, the idea that it will only be through going out and actually striving to build your life against the forces of nature that your humanity will actually be won.
Okay, thanks. Anything you want to come back on?
I'll just do two quick things. Just on the happy fall. I think that the connection between the happy fall and free will is there's a part in Paradise Lost where you really get the sense that there's something about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden before they're tempted, or the bits that are kind of most beautiful poetry is as they are being tempted. There's something about paradise with no tension that doesn't work for us, which is why I was saying that God could come over as boring. I mean, in fact, in Faust, he doesn't come over as boring, but that's because he becomes one of the lads. If you know what I mean, he kind of becomes human in order for us to get him. So it seems to me that the happy fall is the recognition that if you are just good, you never have to choose to be good. And therefore, through the fall, you are forced to choose. And then there's something about the quality of the prayers, that's what I was going to say, is when they then go back and say sorry to God and pray to God, you believe it more and it's more sincere than before when they had to think what to do but to pray to God, if you know what I mean. So that's the kind of dilemma. Obviously, this is not true, as it were, and therefore you're trying to work out how you understand it. But I think that we therefore understand that that conflict is also part of the our attempt at becoming ourselves. That kind of and so people who kind of are complacent and just think they're fine are the kind of people you'd never sit at dinner with, talk to, or want to know, and they're boring and they're not, you know, they're less human. And so on. So there's something in that. I also wanted to just answer Dave's point about it being a conservative book, because maybe I didn't explain this properly, because I don't think that Robinson Crusoe's Lockean. I was trying to say it's said to be Lockean and it's said to be anti-Hobbesian, if you know what I mean. And then there's like endless arguments about which bit indicates which. I mean, to the point where people actually say, you know, when he makes them sign a contract, they say, oh, that's Lockean. I mean, you know, it's like almost like Robinson Crusoe, it's like checklists, you know, for and against. And I just think that, for me, it's neither a conservative book nor anything, but you know, you can read it's a great novel, and that therefore relates to the transcendental point, right? That I was trying to actually almost set myself up by saying, oh look, this is an argument about Hobbes, but actually no, it's not really in the end. So obviously it's useful and it's important to understand. There's nothing wrong with knowing the historical context in which a great work of art has been written. But if you can only access the great work of art by understanding the historical context in which it's been written, it's not a work of art. And so Robinson Crusoe is not dependent on you knowing, have even heard of Hobbes or Locke at any point, just because we're doing this course. I was kind of setting it up. And the concept of a civil war, you don't have to know the specifics of the Civil War. And even Swift, by the way, because Swift is the person that you can literally go through and name everybody. I mean, you know each satire, you know the small heels and the big heels of these people, you know the big enders and the small enders of that, you know Balfour's in there, and people who spent, the Royal Society's in there. But you don't have to know any of that to get the scathing wit of the concepts that he's taking on. And so in that sense, I was just trying to make that point, really, I think.
Any more questions? The lady here has been waiting for quite a long time, so I'll go to you first and I'll come to you.
I wanted to address this question about Satan being the place where all the action is in Paradise Lost, because I'm not quite sure of the answer. And this is, so I'm going to offer my interpretation. And it seems that it's a literary device that Milton uses to show the degeneration of Satan as he becomes more estranged from God. So Satan starts off as this great, magnificent, Promethean type, figure. And then as he gradually degenerates and rejects the path back to God that Abdiel takes, he physically degenerates, and he also changes through the course of Paradise Lost. It's like, it becomes worse and worse and worse because of his inner weakness. And I think it's also a way that Milton is able to show the difference between the epic that he's written, which is much more about creating a moral universe, and the traditional epics, which were much more, military epics about creating a nation. And even though you wouldn't say Satan was a hero, in the past, the heroes in the traditional epics, I think that you would describe them as pawns acting out, even though they were individuals, they were acting out roles already assigned to them by the gods. Whereas in Paradise Lost, Satan, the anti-hero, because he has free choice and makes bad choices, he's not acting out the will of God in that sense. He's acting from, his own will, and as a consequence of that, and as a consequence of making those bad choices, he goes further and further into the depths of hell, to the point, as Claire said, where hell is not just it's not just that Milton creates a literary device of a physical hell that Satan can be in, but hell is in him as well. And there is no path back to God by then. But, there's a path to earth along, the path that death and sin have created. But he's degenerated so far that there's no path back to heaven. And the key difference, I think, apart from him being a bad guy, to Satan and the other epic heroes, is that Satan changes throughout the novel. And at any point, he could change, even when Gabriel takes him back to God, he could still choose the path back to God, but he changes negatively. And as he chooses more and more to be disobedient to God, then he physically degenerates. And I think that helps the reader see Satan's degeneration. Not just physically, but the gap between when he starts off being this great champion against tyranny, the reader's able to see that there's a complete difference between what he says and what he's actually doing.
Okay, thanks, Keith. Just, to Alan.
Thank you very much.
The lady over here.
Thank you. I wanted to pursue that theme, which I thought was central in what Claire said about striving, which Jenny, I think, elucidated very well. But the risk of being too schematic, I'd like to expand a little. I mean, the name that hasn't come up, which perhaps should in this context, is Prometheus. And in that sense, we are looking at a beginning. The taking of fire from the gods, and as a result, getting your liver pecked out for eternity while chained to a mountain. But the interesting thing about that is that, Marx's doctoral dissertation had this quotation from Prometheus, and in the game he played with his children, he put down his favourite pastime as to struggle. And I think we are, the next time, it's just before Marx, Prometheus is used as the subtitle for Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. And of course, the increasingly contemporary reading of Frankenstein is don't meddle with nature, that it's hubristic. Whereas Mary Shelley's point in it was he didn't go far enough. He didn't make another monster for love to be created. And I think, and if you just do this, I'm sorry, this crude chronology, is that it's very simple to understand Defoe as not having that problem because he lives in a relatively optimistic period. From the 19th century onwards, you get increasingly hubristic assumptions about humanity, whether it's Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, the Inquisitor General, or later Eliot's Humankind Cannot Bear Too Much Truth. And increasingly we get dystopias, not utopias. And I think if you then go back, and just to finish, hopefully not too crudely, I think Milton said of the work himself, Paradise Lost, that he was justifying the works of God to man because he was having to come to terms personally and socially with the defeat of the English Revolution, the aspiration. And it comes out even clearer in the shorter works, such as Agonistes, Suffering and Striving. And I think that's why it's a good point to conclude in what Claire was saying about Goethe, finishing on a reconciliation with industrialisation, which is the torment of the romantic imagination and the torment of modern people. And it's really struck me, there's a very good compilation of material put together by the English documentarist Humphrey Jennings called Pandemonium, which relates precisely back to the idea of pandemonium in Satan. And I think that's what is being grappled with. The idea that redemption cannot be by going back to create harmony. We live in strife. And if at the risk of not lowering the tone, to quote the Belfast Cowboy, it's too late to stop now.
Okay, thanks.
I wanted to just say something, just a very quick response to that. I mean, we're going to discuss Frankenstein tomorrow, or at least it's on the readings for tomorrow. It could be, any of these books could be anywhere, if you know what I mean. But I think that it really struck me on the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and the Dorian Gray, actually how depressing they were as well. I mean, so they're kind of later. So there's no God. I mean, there's lots of, where there's references to souls and sin and devils and so on, they're actually, nobody means them in terms of religion. and they're struggling with the kind of inner beast in man. You know, there's the kind of Darwinian context, are we more animal than, and so on, but the kind of all the dark, seedy side of London. And when you think, so when you think about what ends there, I mean, both of them end badly. And I mean, that was the next bit of the speech. Obviously, I've been going on forever. But that was the next bit of the speech that I wanted to do, which was that, you know, happy ends earlier, but actually when you get there, they all die, and it's all horrible, and so, you know, and so on and so forth. So I think that it is interesting to consider the progressive, depressing way that it's dealt with. But I think it's also the case that we shouldn't read too much backwards either, because they are still trying to imagine the same kind of things, but just in different contexts, which is what I was.
Yeah, can I see some more hands so I can?
I just wanted to continue this thing, because there's that element of the literature in different times speaking about their understanding of the human spirit, and then there's us reading those works and our understanding of the human spirit. And what's really striking is how, when you read Mary Shelley or you read the Goethe, is their affirmation of life-affirming human activity. And then you get readers of Goethe like Marx, or you get readers of Goethe like Freud, and the metaphors that they take from that are very much life-affirming ones that sort of contradict. I assumed when you read Faust it must be something about human hubris, but it's the opposite. And so it's the devil that is saying human activity bad. And so at the time that Faust is reclaiming the land, you've got Mephistopheles saying, "You're just digging your own grave, ha ha ha, don't try." And yet again, that metaphor is taken up by Marx, grave digging in a positive humanist way. And the same way when we come to look at Freud takes that metaphor of land reclamation. He says that's what his psychoanalysis is trying to do. His project is like reclaiming the Zeta Z project, so that you have that effort of also trying to transcend body and soul. So you have Freud saying, my work to do with the human psyche is also like those engineers building this Zeta Dam project that's going to stop the Netherlands flooding.
Okay, thanks. There was, yes, sorry, you've been waiting quite a while. So I'll go to you, and then just there. No, to there first, yeah.
Okay, so this is very interesting discussion, very difficult, but one of the things I kind of wanted to throw in is the question of religion, and why religion is the kind of, in a way, the focus of these works, and the kind of relationship between man and God, and what is kind of going on there, and sort of, at the risk of reading history backwards, sort of looking at the idea of the death of God, which to some extent, sort of from the Frank's talk this morning, you kind of see, was Hobbes an atheist? Had God died for him? And these works being written in a context where, to extent, the world of God had been already overthrown to a large extent by the very fact of the world emerging into a kind of a questioning about the structure of society and government. So, in that context, sort of like, I was quite interested in what David was saying about Robinson Crusoe, because that also struck me about his grasping at God. That he refused God, he neglected God. He arrived on this island, and he set himself up, and he realised that his life was empty and pointless without God. What was he striving for? Why was he existing without God? And so it's that kind of eternal problem, I think, that a lot of the great literature strives with, is just this sense of how can we exist? What are we striving for if it is not for God? And when that God goes, vanishes from our imaginations, the striving itself potentially becomes almost pointless. And that's one of the reasons why I think some of these works, reading both Faust and Paradise Lost, which I'm ashamed to say I haven't read before. I was just completely bowled over by how beautifully crafted they were, how these two human beings, Milton and Goethe, had kind of taken language and had used it in this way of expressing some incredibly imaginative, superlatively imaginative world, completely beyond any kind of necessity of communication. In an attempt, was it an attempt to recover God at that, or was it an attempt to find a way of working without God in that sense? So, that's sort of like just the question, but it's one of those puzzles that when you come back to literature, I think it's fantastic reading this, when you come back to literature, with a sense of history, it's amazing how, it is remarkable what artists have done in the past to really strive to understand what life is like without God, or can we live without God, how do we find God in ourselves?
Okay, thanks. And Nalamba, I think you had your hand up.
I'd probably like to pose a question that's more interpersonal and moves away from the mythologic Satan as a character, because it seems that he's irredeemable. And the question I have is, are we justified to rebel from God if we feel a sense of moral outrage?
Okay, thank you. Interesting question. Profound. Can I have any more hands? Can we go all the way to Craig? Sorry.
Yeah, I think my point might be vaguely similar to what's just been said, but I think one of Satan's big problems is really that he has no choice but to love God when he's in heaven. There's nothing else he can do. He's not actually understand why either. At one point during the rebellion, he even says, who is this God? He says he's the one who created us. He might have just been here first. We haven't tested him. Who says he gets to be God? So obviously he doesn't really do well, but then he gets sent to hell. But it seems to me that Satan frees man from the prison of God's love, as it was, and what he gives us is the freedom to choose between hell, the prisons of hell, or heaven, and that's the kind of thing for me. I didn't quite understand sometimes while reading Paradise Lost, the kind of idea that freedom is to love God, to be not free is not to. I mean, what kind of freedom is that? Love God or not? I mean, I don't quite get that.
Okay, thanks. And Jarrell, is there a microphone for Jarrell?
Okay, so Claire, there was one question that you posed, that why is knowledge always put in a bad light, in a negative light? And while that seems true, I think it will be better to rephrase it as not knowledge in itself that's bad, but the self that pursues knowledge for itself that's bad. Because it boils down to hubris. When I would see Satan, okay, there were two falls in Christianity. First was Satan's fall and then man's fall. And Satan's fall alludes to man's fall in that in the original, so Satan's name was Lucifer. And in old Latin texts, it was Lucifera. Lucid means bright and fera means star. So the notion of evil being like dark, gloomy, and the slimy kind of disgusting evil, does not hold in that context. It's precisely because he had hubris and he wanted to shine brighter than God himself, and that caused his downfall. And it's the self that wants to pursue absolute knowledge of the entire world without being able to have a room for God. The self that wants to conquer everything, that causes his very demise. And so I would think that the Christian faith warns us in some sense about the dangers of reason, which is very palpably elucidated in our modern day and age, and how pursuing utility, reason, assuming universality of certain notions that man is good, man is evil, man is historically determined, man is materially determined, whatever. All these absolute universal ideas that stems from any person, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, whatever, whoever comes up with these first premises, are bound to immediate failure because any mere mortal's attempt to universalize anything about imperfect humans is self-righteous. And okay, let's give a
Quick as
real
you
life
can.
example. Pardon?
Quick as you can.
Okay, real life example. Marxism. So Marxists say that the whole world is historical materialism, and he says that we need to the proletariat must overthrow the bourgeois, and he postulates a utopia at the end, which is communism. But anybody who claims to self-righteousness is actually the one that is evil. It's not the person who is evil, but it's the person who claims that he is good that is evil. And this claim to goodness is born through reason, and that's why I think that it's not knowledge per se, but it's the hubristic notion of claiming knowledge and universality.
Okay.
That's wrong. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Sorry for being so long.
It's okay. Last thoughts?
Well, I'll come back to Jarell's last comment, just to make the point that, you know, it's not that you spoke for so long, but I think that this is that you do have to refer at some point to what we're trying to grapple with in the literature. I'm interested in those political views as you are. I just completely disagree with you on them. But I think that the point is that that's a different point, right? And that relates in a way to why you read, you know, the relationship of literature and religion and God and so on. I mean, not everyone will agree with this, of course, but I actually think that religion is a metaphor, but there we go. A great work of imagination by man. But the point is that Milton wrote this in good faith as a religious person. But as a religious person, he could have just said, read the Bible. Right? And why didn't he just tell everyone to read the Bible, right? He wrote an epic poem. And that means he created a work of art. And although he says in that work of art, this is to explain God's ways to men, you know, you could say God could do it, but you know, what I'm trying to say is he creates a work of art, and that work of art is not a religious work of art, although it has in it those different aspects. So, you know, I think that we can understand the nature of man from reading Milton's Paradise Lost and understand how man is conceived of in the context of a religious discussion, if you see what I mean. And I think that concepts like original sin, temptation, Satan and so on have been useful for us, or you could, over the years, that's the kind of language that has been used to explain the dilemmas that man has got into, and so on and so forth. So the fall being one of them. So I think that, you know, because one of the things I suppose that I am just a bit wary of is that one of the reading, I don't think I put it in, I'm pretty sure I didn't, but you know, it's kind of like, you know, it was an attack on, you know, the conversion in, what's it called? Robinson Crusoe. You know, it's like, it's like as though we're having an argument about whether he should convert or not. I mean, it's a novel. You know, you know what I mean? And Satan doesn't exist. Broadly. No, that's a question of faith, right? But in literature, Satan does exist in Paradise Lost. So the only conversation we can have about Satan is in the context of Paradise Lost or in Faust. I'm only making that one just so that we can kind of try and pull it apart. So, you know, I'm all for talking about any of those things, but that's not so. But I think that Craig, however, did raise a useful point, which is that that's one of the dilemmas, is it not? Of actually nothing. That's the dilemma in general about free man. How free are you really? So, you know, we're free but you're not allowed to rebel against this. It's not. You're not only in that position in the heaven-hell scenario. You can see that is something that we can all kind of relate to. But I think that is the thing which I think Milton grapples with brilliantly and sometimes less satisfactorily, and trying to resolve it both through poetry and through trying to resolve the free will question. I mean, these things are the things which theologians and philosophers have thought about for many years and then try and express. So I don't think it's a kind of practical question, which is, well, I'd rebel if I was Satan too up there and I had to. I mean, that's not really what we're being asked to consider, and it's not that you have to say, oh, I think that the amount of freedom that is given to them, you have to see it out of the context of love God and then you're free. It's how that imaginatively is conceived as free will that's not determined by God that is the kind of great artistic creation that we read. The other thing was just in relation to, that's the way I've tried to understand it anyway. The other thing is about the dangers of reason and so on. I mean, I think it's, I'm never quite sure myself why knowledge always gets the bad kind of deal. Because I did agree with your point, Alan, about Frankenstein being misread today, and that's the way I see it. But I did actually think, I do actually think that knowledge does get in reason. Knowledge and reason are different, but sometimes some of the things which I feel as though I most admire are the things which seem to be kind of blame for man's downfall on occasion. But what I was going to say was that one thing that we should remember is that reason is that man's natural state, or that's the way it's argued, that an animal is not able to have reason, and therefore man in his natural state has reason. But reason is not right reason, and right reason, is more informed by God or conscience, and so that's why we make the distinction. So you can be reasonable or use your reason. You can be rational and use your rationality. But that does not mean that you necessarily are being fully human. Because you can misuse it. That's the point I'm trying to make. So I think it's trying to make those finer distinctions that we can at this point. And obviously Wagner and the idea of the knowledge, it's not that, obviously I'm one of the people who argues for knowledge for its own sake, so I get defensive when I read the Wagner stuff, because they know but actually that's ridiculous because it's a work of art. And the point about Wagner in that, it seems to me, is that when he actually asks the question, how can I impress people and make them passionate about ideas and knowledge, why is nobody interested in knowledge? He probably says, and Faust says, well, you have to become passionate about it. You have to, really believe all this. And he says, oh no, I don't agree with that. I agree. I think what we need is more elocution and better, and so on and so forth. So he actually is the betrayer of knowledge. And the fact that he creates this thing for and can't even understand it's not life, means that it's not really knowledge, and the real embodiment of knowledge is Faust, in my opinion. That'll do it.
Okay, thanks.